The book of Jonah. Well, we learn in 2 Kings 14:25 that Jonah is actually the court prophet of Jeroboam, the king that has just assumed the reins up in Samaria. So Jonah actually has a day job, a normal day job as the prophet to a wicked king. So the story of the whale really is kind of a side story. But as for that story, of course, it's really a story built on irony all the way through. Jonah is called twice. He disobeys the first call, and then he obeys the second call. In each case, he is being called to a group of non-Jews or Gentiles who both, in both instances, understand Yahweh better than he does. So there's a bit of irony in the whole story of the book. Of course, Jonah is called at the beginning of the book to go to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh is the capital of Assyria, about 500 miles to the north and east of here. It is the great enemy of Israel, and within less than 100 years, Assyria will be coming in to destroy the northern kingdom. So it's really the worst possible storyline that Jonah could have heard. You need to go to our archenemy and give them a message of what turns out to be grace. So Jonah is afraid. He goes down to the port city of Joppa, and he heads as far west as he could. We're not sure really where Tarshish is. It could be all the way out to Spain, but the main point of the story is he heads west when he should have gone east. Well, of course, the mariners on the ship, they know that something's wrong because of the storm, and so they cry out, "Call upon your Elohim," and they say that, of course, to everyone on the boat, but then they find Jonah asleep. They wake him up and they realize that he needs to call on his God. And we remember that Jonah even said, "I serve Yahweh, the Elohim who made heaven and earth." So he admits at that point, the God I serve is really the God who's responsible for this whole storm. And at that point, what they do is well described by the Expositor's Bible Commentary. Let me read what they have to say. "Here was a God's servant who had a falling out with his Lord. In a culture in which correct procedure in the service of the gods was essential, they," that's the mariners, "had not merely to do the will of Yahweh, but also to do it correctly." So the point is, as an act of worship, they believed, and it was probably a temporary worship at that, but they, in chapter 1, verse 16, they cast Jonah into the sea, presumably as a sacrifice. In other words, Jonah couldn't jump in on his own. They had to do it for him as a sacrifice, and intending to kill him, apparently. Well, of course, God had a different plan. A great fish, never called a whale, of course, picks him up in the water, and 3 days later deposits him somewhere on land. And chapter 2 is all given to this great poetry, which is a mix of a lot of the Proverbs, or the Psalms. And so Jonah is a great theologian, and he admits that God is God, and that he has the responsibility to follow this God in his will. So when he gets deposited back on land, he hears the same call at the beginning of chapter 3. He heads inland, east and north, up to the huge city of Nineveh, 60 miles in circumference. The sermon that he preaches in chapter 3, verse 4 is very short, only 5 words in Hebrew. Basically, it goes 40 days and Nineveh will be destroyed. No hope of salvation really being part of that message that we know of. Now, he must have talked about Yahweh, because we hear in chapter 3, verse 5, the opening words of that verse are, "To Elohim Aman." In other words, to God loyalty. So apparently the Ninevites, a vast majority of them apparently, switched their loyalties from the gods of Assyria to Yahweh, and so Yahweh relented. Chapter 3, verse 10, he changes his mind. And so really we're beginning the last chapter of the book in a best case scenario. I mean, Jonah's alive, the Ninevites have repented, even God has repented. So of course what could go wrong, right? But the story then turns in an interesting way to the tremendous sadness that Jonah feels because of the lack of destruction of the Ninevite or the Assyrian kingdom. So is there a story to be told here? Well, very importantly, yes, and that is, of course, Jonah's frustration was, and let me put it into his ideological distress, let me put it into this question. Here's what Jonah was thinking. How can grace and mercy that which forms the basis of the Israelite story, be extended to the Gentile nations like Assyria as well. In other words, he didn't have a category for this because everything he knew about the Jewish story was that, well, Jews were separate. And we've had this all through, of course, the Old Testament story, that because Jews were chosen by Yahweh and were loyal to Yahweh, or should have been, and the Gentiles, because they worshipped other gods, that because of this basic storyline, God would judge the Gentiles and he would be gracious to the Jew. But what happens in the story, of course, is that, and this is very key, Jonah does not preach Torah to these people. In other words, feast seasons and sacrifices and temple worship and such. He doesn't preach Levitical law. He simply says, become loyal to Yahweh. And because many do, the main point of the story, and again, this is hard for Jonah to fathom, to even have a category in his head, that God is not intent on treating Gentiles differently than Jews because of race, tribe, or family. And so here is the action point, really, for this book, this story, at this point in our larger story, that God will be willing and has been willing. I think this is something we can go back and see evidence of. But God is willing to treat not these two peoples as separate families, but now he is willing to treat all people alike when it comes to their loyalty to him.